I think that language makes it so we become an organism that can be very good at ignoring things, rationalizing, ignoring impending problems. So we have extraordinary foresight. We are extraordinarily visionary as a creature, but we are also extraordinarily delusional. That just comes with the territory of language. I don't share the contempt for humankind that I hear among some of my friends lamenting the current tragedies. We are right on schedule. This is exactly the kind of problem we would be dealing with as an organism making effort drunk on language.
Welcome to Books and Ideas, the podcast where we talk with interesting people from a wide variety of fields. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and today I will be talking with Jeremy Sherman, author of Neither Ghost Nor Machine, The Emergence and Nature of Selves. I'll tell you more about today's episode in just a minute, but first I want to remind you that you can get additional episodes of Books and Ideas on my website at booksandIdeas.com. You can subscribe for free in your favorite podcasting app. You can send me feedback at docartemis@gmail.com. Submit voicemail to speakpipe.com/docartemis. Artemis is spelled Artemis. You can also post to the Books and Ideas fan page on Facebook. I need to mention that starting in April 2020, I'm moving Books and Ideas from the 15th of the month to the third Friday of the month. This is just to even out my production schedule. So I want to give you a little bit of background about today's episode. My guest is Jeremy Sherman, who teaches at Cal Berkeley, where he's been a longtime colleague of Terrence Deacon. Deacon is probably best known for his book, The Symbolic Species, but I interviewed him on Books and Ideas back in 2012 when he released his book, Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerged from Matter. That was episode 47. The key question Deacon set out to answer was, how did purpose emerge from a purposeless universe? Or as Sherman would say, how did mattering emerge from matter? Deacon's work is fascinating, but because he has a tendency to invent new terminology, his work is not easy to read. In contrast, over the years, Dr. Sherman has written over 1,000 blog posts about Deacon's work. His goal is to make Deacon's ideas more accessible to a general audience, and he accomplishes this masterfully in Neither Ghost Nor Machine. Obviously, we can only touch on the highlights in an interview, but I'll be back afterwards to review the key ideas and to share a few brief announcements. Welcome to Books and Ideas, Jeremy. I'm so happy to have you on the show today to talk about your fascinating book, Neither Ghost Nor Machine, The Emergence and Nature of Selves.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Would you start out by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I have taken a circuitous route to where I am these days. My first career was in environmental activism. I spent about 20 years working on issues, primarily climate change and nuclear war issues. And then I got very interested in human nature, you could say, or the human condition, and was first drawn to evolutionary psychology. And this was during what I would describe, honestly, as a midlife crisis, maybe around 38 years old. Kind of balked at the size, the overwhelm of the issues I was addressing, and you could say my impotence in dealing with them. So at that point, I turned my attention to the human condition, evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, then complexity theory. And around that time, I met Terrence Deacon, who was at that time a Harvard neuroscientist working on basically the evolution of language. He's a remarkable professor in that he doesn't pull rank. He's interested in conversations with anyone who's interested in the topics he's interested in. He was just turning his attention from the evolution of language to the emergence of selves and effort, organisms, and the struggle for existence, which he recognized Darwin assumed but didn't explain. Darwin also sort of acknowledges that. So Terry was just turning his attention to that around the time I proposed that I get a PhD with him. So that's about 24 years ago now. Since then, he's been my mentor, certainly, but more and more we became collaborators, friends, allies in this work, with a primary focus on that big question, the emergence of selves and effort. And then this book came out of my work with him about 22 years in. I realized that we needed a more accessible, intuitive, easy explanation of his theories. He writes densely, and a lot of people don't recognize just how accessible he is as a thinker, and his theories are. I think his theories are actually quite intuitive, but that wouldn't necessarily come through from his academic writing. So that's where my book came from. It was an attempt to make accessible the ideas in his two books.
So how about we start out with just a brief overview of Neither Ghost Nor Machine?
The question at the core of the book is a simple one. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." I want to say, I try, therefore I am. I make effort. I strive. I struggle for my existence. And not just me and not just humans, but all organisms do. Organisms try to stay alive. They try to stay alive and reproduce. They don't all try to evolve, and evolution isn't trying to get them to evolve either. But the core question is, what is trying and how did it start? It's a question that we have not been able to answer for so very long that I sometimes get the impression that we want to avoid the question, almost like dejected lovers. We'd rather not talk about it. It's surprising how little research addresses that question directly. The way I would frame it is that trying is something different, yet from nothing but physiochemistry. There's nothing added. We don't defy the laws of physical chemistry. So when I say there's nothing added, there's no ghost in the machine, in the mechanisms of physiochemistry. So you can think of physiochemistry, it's not a machine. Machines are functional, but it's mechanical in that it's a bunch of cause and effect relationships. Selves still have all of that going on. Selves are the things that make effort. They make effort on their own behalf. They engage in what I could call self-directed work. It's work by a self for its own benefit with respect to its circumstances. So you can see that in that framing of what has to be explained and hasn't been explained for so long, you've got three inescapable features of the life and social sciences, which are function, fittedness, and effort. So selves do work for themselves. So they do work, that's effort, for themselves, that's function. With respect to their environment, that's fittedness. You cannot escape function, fittedness, and effort when you're working in the life and social sciences, and yet they're completely impermissible in the physical sciences. If a physics professor said that the moon pulls on the tides in order to achieve something, it would be completely unacceptable. But right down the hall, a psychologist or a biologist is perfectly entitled to talk that way. So there's this great chasm down the middle of our academic institutions, down our research institutions, and that has not been explained. So the book is an attempt to explain it, and the explanation, the answer to that riddle, selves and effort are something different yet from nothing but physiochemistry, turns out to be quite intuitive. The one that we propose is quite intuitive. It makes a lot of sense. And what I have admired about Terry's work is that he doesn't permit gaps. He doesn't get to smuggle in the terminology that implies function, fittedness, or effort. He really was meticulous in his effort to try to figure out how, from the simplest chemistry, basically classical physics and chemistry, how you would ever get a system that is engaged in self-directed work by itself for its own benefit with respect to its circumstances.
So why does this mystery matter?
The mystery matters because it is dealing with the whole question of mattering. It's interesting that the quest for the theory of everything in physics doesn't actually include anything that matters to us. All of physics and chemistry can matter to us, But the theory is not pursuing an explanation for what the will is. Our entire lives, we are obsessed with ourselves and with our effort. If you aggregate what keeps people up at night, it will be questions about their selves and what effort they should engage in. And it's a marvel to me, now that I'm exposed to this work, now that I'm steeped in this work, how rarely we ever get to the question of what a self is, what effort is. Effort is obviously work, but it's not just any work. It's focused work. It's constrained work. Of all the things I could do, I engage in some kind of prioritization. So to me, it's the elephant in the room. It's the obvious question. And I also need to say, most people balk at the question. I just think it's as central as it gets. I mean, the fact that you asked me, why does it matter? The whole point is mattering.
One of the things you brought out in your book that I want to highlight at this moment is the fact that avoiding this mystery alienates science from non-scientists. I mean, because when scientists act as if this is not an important question or it's an illusion or whatever, they alienate non-scientists. I remember telling Terry when I interviewed him back in 2012, the story of my niece, who's a brilliant young woman, and she was still in high school back then, and her saying to me that she hated science. You know, I really think this is what it gets down to is, you know, if you ignore what makes life meaningful, then you can't be surprised when people think that science is not for them. Moving back to Terry's idea, I know that you're working to make his ideas accessible to a wider audience, and in your book, you avoid most of his technical terms. But I think we should start out with clarifying a few basic terms, and these are not technical at all, but we still need to specify what we mean by them. Let's start with what you mean when you talk about selves.
Yes, so I can start with a circular description, and we have to avoid circularity in this work, but to describe it, I would say that selves are the entities that make effort, and that effort is what selves make. That is the common characteristic of all selves. Terry and I go back and forth on finding the right words for all of these concepts we want to focus on. Selves can sound a little human. I have several friends who just balk at the thought that a tree is a self or that a bacterium is a self. So I'm happy to call them organisms. That's fine. People get confused about what makes effort. I know esteemed scientists who actually think that there's no difference between a river trying to get to the sea and me trying to survive and reproduce. I don't think that's an accurate place to cut the universe at its joints. Obviously, in cognitive science, there's a whole lot of talk as though computers are like selves. That is, computers think or try, and selves are just computers. So dealing with what Terry describes as a Cartesian wound and what you were just describing about the turnoff to science, I like the title I landed on for my book because it corners me not on the page one, but on the cover with two explanations that won't do. So I'm rejecting a supernatural explanation, the ghost in the machine, God, spirit, soul, as a supernatural force. And I should also add that I am also rejecting in that concept the more scientific-y sounding versions of ghosts. So I'm rejecting that on the cover, and I'm rejecting the thing that makes science look so heartless, which is that we are just machines. I had a fabulous conversation with a woman scientist who was invited to become the chief scientist for Amazon, and her specialty was work on mind-machine interfaces. I asked her, is a mind just a machine? And she said, well, nothing has been added to the mechanics of neuroscience. So yes, I have to say it's a machine. So it's just a machine-to-machine construct. So the ghost and machine framing is trying to corner us with a legitimate scientific question. And the burden is on science. That is, I actually admire religion for admitting that we ourselves making effort. I'm happy to describe our work to explain selves as work to explain souls or spirits, or agency or interiority. I don't care if we have a technical sounding name or a spiritual sounding name. It doesn't matter because naming is not explaining. Naming is just a black box. So selves basically mean that thing that people intuit as a soul or spirit or will or agency, whatever it is that disappears when you die. It can be as intuitive as that. The explanation is a different thing.
Right. And in the book, what I got was the first selves were the first living beings. Being a self means being alive. So any living thing would be a self.
That's right. Now, Terry and I and the rest of us who do this research will debate whether the very first self, what he's called an autogen, would actually be called living. That's a subject that's open to debate. But I think for a first approximation, we're basically trying to explain the difference between living and dead. As simple as that.
So what about the difference between, and this is more subtle, the difference between cause and effect and means to ends?
I said earlier that nothing that an organism does, a self does, defies the laws of cause and effect. And cause and effect is a complicated technical question within philosophy, but for a simplification, which people somehow intuit and keep going back to, you can think about cause and effect as billiard balls. This bumps into that and alters it. It's basically work done by interacting particles, atoms, whatever. Things interact and they yield results. Means to ends behavior is rather different from that in some way. So, for example, if I'm a pool player and I am aiming to get the 8 ball into the side pocket, and so I hit the cue ball, I have all sorts of cues in me, you could say, for doing that, my aims, my goals, wanting to win the game. But the cue ball isn't actually taking cues from me. It's not actually listening to me, gaining information, doing things to satisfy its boss so it can keep its job. None of that is going on in the cue ball. So there's obviously a transition, and we all know it intuitively, but we also smear that distinction. Poetry is full of that. And I actually write a fair amount of poetry. It's just not my scientific work. It's a different thing. And I write doggerel. I try to figure out how to make ideas accessible, and limericks is a good form. But to get back to the poetic use of that, I could smear it by saying that the river is striving to get to the sea, or the wind is caressing the trees, or whatever. And I can also do it in reverse. I can say this idea had an impact on me. That's a reference to work. A whole lot of our metaphors to explain the life processes will end up using physicalist metaphors. Some researchers, like George Lakoff, have made a big deal out of how we can't help but think in physicalistic metaphors. And I think that's true. We still have to explain why there is this dramatic difference between the things that are done on some self's behalf. That's what I mean by effort. It's really hard to think about good and bad, that is useful and not useful, functional, non-functional, or effort without thinking that there's a beneficiary, some entity, some living entity who benefits from it. The universe can't be just good for the universe. Maybe it is, but we really do feel an intuitive mind wrench when we think of benefit or effort, that is the things we describe with means to ends behavior, without thinking of an organism who's the beneficiary of it.
Let's talk about some of the most popular, I think we could call them non-solutions to the mystery of purpose. You've already alluded to the major ghost, which is supernaturalism. But what are the ones that scientists tend to fall back on?
One of the most popular versions, almost heralded as a vindication for the mechanistic worldview, is the selfish gene concept. And it was a real turn on for me to read that book back when I first did. The New York Times referred to The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins as a book that makes every reader feel like a genius. And I think that's true. And part of it is that it gives a very colorful description of a colorless universe. But the color is what shines through in that book. It's very lively writing. The selfish gene model has a paradox built right into it. What is a gene? Well, there's two versions of what a gene is in conventional thinking, or that is everyday understanding of it. One is that it's a molecule of DNA. Well, molecules are not selves. They're not trying to achieve anything. The burden is on scientists to explain how molecular interaction could ever yield means to ends behavior. But to simply declare molecules to be selves doesn't do it. It's an equivocation, and it's acknowledged as such. Dawkins makes clear that he doesn't really mean that genes are selfish. He's saying that they're tantamount to selfish. It's a good pedagogical tool. He's basically affording himself poetic, or you could say pedagogical license. He's saying it's easier to understand if we treat them as selfish. And the process he's describing has its role, but there is some predictive utility that pays attention to DNA, population changes over evolutionary time, all of that. But the point is that the molecule itself is not trying to do anything. Molecules don't. And molecules replicate in chemistry plenty without them being living systems. So to simply say that you get these molecules and they start replicating, and the better replicators ornament themselves with replicator vehicles. So your body or your selfhood is just a vehicle for the DNA to pass on. That doesn't quite work. It's an equivocation. Now, an alternative perspective, more accurate to the scientific understanding of what a gene is that a gene is a pattern within a molecule. So it's not the DNA, but the pattern within the DNA. All well and good, but patterns themselves are not trying to do anything either. So that's an idea that plays out beautifully as mechanical poetics. It's a wonderful framing. It got me turned on to the whole field of research. But by now, I'd say that dog doesn't hunt. It doesn't actually explain how you ever get means to ends behavior out of cause and effect phenomena. It tries to explain it away and then dances on either side of that issue, which is what you'll find in general across the current explanations. That is, they equivocate. Sometimes they talk as though molecules are just machine, and sometimes they'll talk as though they have motivations. You'll get that in cognitive science too. Another alternative that shows up, you could say, out of the selfish gene model, is that evolution or natural selection is a positive force. It is a little bit like Noah choosing the animals to go on the ark, or like God choosing who survives and who doesn't. He's a designer. He is, as Dawkins put it in the title of one of his books, a blind watchmaker. Well, watchmakers, whether blind or not, are still trying to make watches. And there are several researchers who want to loosen the definition of design such that they could say that evolution designs this or that trait. A guy like Dennett, Steve Pinker also writes as if to loosen the definition of design so that you can talk about natural selection as designing. Well, from our perspective, natural selection is not a positive force. It's basically entropy as applied to selves and trying. That is, selves are the business end. And Darwin recognizes, he says it's a struggle for existence, that is, organisms striving on their own behalf. Natural selection is just what prunes or eliminates, and it does it passively. Things will fall. We are all trying to stay aloft, and things fall. That is, things fall towards failure. So from my perspective, to claim that natural selection explains life is a lot like claiming that erosion explains mountains. Yes, it explains how they get, you could say, honed, but not what they are. So those are two examples. I talked about the genes, and I'm talking about evolution as attempts to answer that we think don't answer, they equivocate. And then I'll just mention very briefly another one or two. I'll actually mention two. One is that we are computers. And another is that quantum mechanics explains what we are. So I'll be going to a conference as the Science of Consciousness, which is dominated by the quantum consciousness argument. I'll be giving a speech there in which I argue that you can't hope to explain consciousness if you haven't explained striving. That is, you can't start up at the level of human consciousness. You have to start by explaining the striving that predates it in all organisms. Otherwise, you're stuck with lots of room for equivocation by treating us as computers, by treating us as quantum computers, none of which are striving. Computer's not trying to do anything. It's an artifact that is useful for me. If you planted 3 billion supercomputers on a sterile planet, what would you get? You'd get a sterile planet. They're not trying.
I want to break in here to mention that I will be releasing a new expanded version of my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, on April 28th, 2020. It will be available both as paperback and as an ebook. Please mark your calendar for April 28th. I'm trying to encourage everyone who can to purchase it from Amazon on April 28th. Reviews are also appreciated. So you had these examples of equivocation, and the other category that I appreciated in the book was, I think you called it eliminativism, which basically says purpose is an illusion, that we're just machines. I sort of thought of Dennett's writing as falling almost more in that category.
Yes, it does. But again, his writing is in the style of Dennett's. I'm fascinated by this work, in part because a lot of my friends are truly enchanted by that work. It is colorful writing about a colorless universe. It's very animated prose. I love it. I try to imitate it in my book. I mean, I try to model it in my own way. I want to write colorfully. But the problem is that underneath it, it is eliminativism. The way it comes down to selves and effort are a figment, an illusion. And then the obvious question is, an illusion to whom? Things are not illusions to chemistry, and things are not illusions to my computer. It's not trying to achieve anything, and therefore it can't be tricked. It's got no aims of its own, so I can't deceive my computer. So what are you saying? So that basically the two main programs are, you're either going to smuggle in a ghost, or you're going to claim there is nothing to explain. Those are the two dodges. And then you could say one of the versions of the ghost is the explanation that effort was always already here. And that would show up in what's called panpsychism, which is basically saying, well, if you look at molecules interacting, it's sort of like they're trying. It's like the river trying to get to the sea. And there are subtler versions of it than I'm giving there, but I think they boil down to that. There's nothing to explain here because function, fittedness, and effort were there in everything from the beginning. And then all you got to do is aggregate enough of it and it comes alive. But there's a problem with that. The galaxies are quite an aggregation of mechanistic interactions, and yet they're not alive in the way that you are. You're way more alive than a tornado, but a tornado sure got a lot of dynamics going on. So what's the deal? You still the burden is still on us to explain the difference between living and non-living systems.
So just going back to evolution for just a second to highlight one of your key ideas, the argument in both your writing and Deacon's is that selves had to occur before evolution, because evolution doesn't explain how the first self happened.
That's right. You could say that the version that starts with the assumption that evolution is a blind watchmaker is almost like suddenly one day a new natural law came into being in the universe, and it was natural selection. And it got to business picking and choosing between things. Now, no one would make this argument. It's way too blatant. But I think it's implied by a lot of this research that simply assumes that evolution explains life. Darwin refused to buy that. He said, I have nothing to say. I have no evidence that my theory explains the origins of life. And it's also kind of obvious when we look at the situation. We've got so many details verifying the way that natural selection works. And yet the origins of life remains a mystery. Well, you would think that if we keep on fleshing out all these details about natural selection, if it explained the origins of life, we would be further along. But also, most of the work on the origins of life is RNA world. It's basically saying if you had a chemical, a special chemical, because it can bear these patterns the way that RNA or DNA does, and it started replicating, that would be enough to explain life. And we don't think so, because it doesn't explain the origins of effort, and effort is the only thing that natural selection ever hones.
Okay, so we'll come back to the RNA issue in a few minutes. And I want to talk about dynamic systems theory and emergence. But before we do that, I do think we should talk a little bit about the role of constraints and also probability.
Great. I'm glad to do that because so far all we've done is talk about the question. And the answer we propose is quite intuitive, and it does relate to those two things. And I actually want to start at the personal level and then come back to the origins of life. Every day I have a to-do list of things that I get to. But the way I get to it is through self-discipline. You could say self-control. That is, I could dither, and I sort of did yesterday. It was Sunday. But today is Monday, and so I have to focus. Of all the things I could do, I have to prioritize some things I do. I have to make it somehow unlikely that I do the things that would be dithering. I have to unlikelify, I can't find a better word for it, those alternative activities. And what am I concentrating on? Well, most fundamentally, I'm concentrating on keeping myself alive. And what does that mean? Well, I'm trying to make it so that tomorrow I can also make unlikely the things on my to-don't list. That is, every day I have to prevent myself from dithering so that I have the wherewithal tomorrow to prevent myself from dithering. And I think that's true of all of us, and it's kind of obvious. And the things I have to do, what do I have to do? Well, I have to make sure I have enough food so that I can replenish what is depleted in my body. But more than that, I have to regenerate myself. That is, everything is constantly under the effects of wear and tear. Things are becoming irregular, mixed up, falling apart. Everything falls towards degeneration. That's the second law of thermodynamics, which is a terrible name for it because it's not a law and it's certainly not second. It's about as big a law as you can ever get. And it's not a law, it's actually a statistical probability. As we all know, there are way more ways for things to be mixed up than there are for things to be in order. So with enough time, things will tend to fall into those mixed up states. And that's what I have to hustle against. As a living being, I have to keep regenerating what degenerates. And then on top of that, since I will eventually succumb to degeneration with death, it's been business in my family line for a long time to have offspring that will then carry on that process of regeneration. So as a result, I have basically three main tasks on my to-do list that I get to through self-discipline, through deliberation, not cognitive deliberation, but by keeping myself from being completely free, by unliberating myself, by making it unlikely that I do the things that would be dithering. The three things I have to get to are self-regeneration, self-protection, and self-reproduction, which is not just a matter of passing on chemical DNA. I have to pass on the whole business of self-regeneration and self-protection. Now, with that in mind, it becomes quite intuitive to think about what would have to happen at the very origins of life. You've got chemistry, it tends to degenerate. You would need a system, you would need dynamics, that is, interactions among multiple parts, in this case, just molecules, that would happen to make it unlikely that it would degenerate. That is, life starts as what you say is death prevention, death being degeneration, and it doesn't start because it wants to. It starts by accident, but once it starts, it's in the business of regenerating at a rate that surpasses degeneration. And it could start many times and fail. That is, there's nothing about the beginning of life that gets it going in some kind of ensured way. But what you could say is that after 3.8 billion years of evolution, life has gotten fairly robust. It could still be game over for all of us. But at this point, it's easy for people to overlook how busy we all are staying aloft, keeping ourselves regenerated, in part because our society is actually stable and safe enough that we assume that living is the default and death is the exception. No, death is the default. Everything's falling towards it all the time. And even while I'm talking to you, even while I'm conscious and feeling, I've got organs in my body that I can't even name that are hustling all day long to regenerate me. And that's how we are. So back to that earlier question, why does any of this matter? The fact is, for most of us, it doesn't matter at all. It's going on the same way it is for that tree. My body is regenerating cells without my awareness, without my feeling it. That's where you start. You have to explain that from the beginning, how we make degeneration unlikely.
Just getting back to the terms that I think we're going to need as we move forward. And I really think that you sort of worked around the ideas, but would you maybe give us simple working definitions for constraint and probability just to get us started?
We assume, and not everybody does, what's called Psychism, or you could say stochastic origin of the universe. That is, we don't think that it's all deterministic cause and effect. We think that there's a degree of randomness about what occurs. That's a debatable point. Our whole theory doesn't rest on it. But what I would say is that probability can be defined different ways. It's often defined as an epistemological problem, which is that we can't figure out what's determined to happen, but it's all determined to happen. Whether you go with that model or whether you go with the model that I just described a moment ago, which is that, no, actually, it's not just a problem in the eyes of the beholder. That is, there is probability at the origins of the universe. That is, it's not certain. It wasn't determined on day one of the universe what would come about by now. That's a longer, complicated question. I have some videos that actually deal with this. One is actually a conversation with God that makes that suggestion. But let's just assume probability. Some things are more likely than other things. Constraint is basically the unlikelifying, a change in what is likely. So I like to work from a very intuitive explanation for this to show that things become unlikely or different things become relatively more likely. So that's the thing. If some things become less likely, other things become more likely. That's what I was getting at when I was talking about not dithering, getting around to my work. So by preventing myself from doing certain things, that makes other things more likely. So imagine that I'm walking at midnight through a town square. And I would go in a straight line. That's the shortest path. And I would just take it, and I would get from one end of the place to the other. Now imagine that I'm doing it the next day at noon, and it's crowded with people threading themselves around each other in every direction. That path of least resistance from the night before is no longer the path of least resistance. It is constrained by the congestion. And congestion is not a thing. It's not a physical thing. You could say it's a change in probabilities that results from the interaction among things. So it's not cause and effect in the same way. I mean, I can give a name to what prevents me from going straight through the square. I can call it congestion, but congestion is not a thing. It's a change in concentrations, you could say. As a result, I will take the now path of least resistance, which is different from the one the night before. I will thread myself through the congestion, taking the path of least resistance through it, but it's a different path than the night before. So that's an explanation for how you can get a kind of unlikeliness from nothing but changes in concentrations of things here and there. And from there, you can actually go to what's called self-organization, though we think that's a lousy name because there's no self, and it's not about organizing towards some objective goal, though humans can certainly make use of the organizations that exist. But take a whirlpool, for example. It is a case of congestion, of a crowd of molecules that are not trying to get anywhere, but they are being pushed and pulled, mostly pushed from behind. That is congestion behind and openings in front, and they're flowing this way and that. And there will be turbulence, much as there would be turbulence in that crowd in the town square. But eventually it would fall towards the path of least resistance, which happens to be that spiral flow that you get in a whirlpool. It's not trying to achieve that. It's completely at the mercy of circumstances. If you stop the flow of the water, there's nothing about the whirlpool that's trying to regenerate itself. And yet it is interesting because it's a regularity that comes about by the unlikeliness that results from congestion. It's been a very important, interesting idea, this idea of self-organization, and its many applications, and not just whirlpools. It shows up in lots of different situations. Why? Because the thing that's interesting about organisms is that we are highly regulated, highly regular. Terry illustrates this by talking about which is actually more complex, a frog or a frog smoothie. A frog smoothie looks to the eye as though it is more simple. It's all just that one color. Gross. But actually, it's a way more complicated, or you could say randomized array or configuration of molecules than you get in the orderly, regularized skin cells, bone cells, etc., of a frog. So what's interesting about us is that we are highly regular, and so is a whirlpool, though obviously in a different way. Not obviously. There are actually plenty of researchers who claim that self-organization explains us and feel vindicated, because now we know there's regularity in a whirlpool, there's regularity in chemical chain reactions, etc. So therefore, that explains selves and effort. We don't think so. We think it's a beautiful, important bridge over to explaining selves, but we do not think that it explains selves.
You just alluded to the idea that dynamic systems theory has been proposed as the answer, and the idea that emergence solves the problem. And you just said, well, it doesn't. I like the words you had in the book where you said, saying that it emerged by emergence doesn't work. Is that equivocation? Or,
yeah.
I mean, or...
No, it's a fundamental issue. Emergence is a little bit like motivation in this one respect. That is, they are both terms that we give to something we know by its consequences. So we name the source of something. I say, well, look at this guy did this thing, so he must have a motive. That doesn't mean I've explained it. Look, a whirlpool came out of the turbulence in water, so I'm going to call it that process emergence. That's what must be explained. So I certainly don't reject the concept of emergence. I just want to avoid the equivocation that happens when you start treating your questions like answers. Terry's been meticulous about this. It's kind of fundamental to how I think about something that's actually a little missing from science, from the science around this issue. That is, because we haven't had an answer so long, it feels like we're kind of relaxing the standards, the scientific standards. The prior sciences, like physics and chemistry, must explain what the subsequent sciences, like life and mind, assume. And until they do, you're merely describing and modeling, and you don't know what you're talking about. Once you have explained emergence, then you can reduce to it. You don't have to keep on reducing to the level of molecules or atoms. So I'm not a reductionist, I'm an emergent reductionist. Once you explain how some category of phenomena emerges from the lower level sciences, then you can reduce to what you have just explained. Most of the emergence literature I read treats emergence more like either a descriptive term or even an explanatory term. We haven't known what it is. I would say that what I just described about the whirlpool, or me going through the crowd, take that crowd and imagine that what happened was spontaneously a roundabout formed in the middle of the crowd. Because roundabouts are actually engineered, designed to have the effect that a whirlpool has. That is, it's designed to reduce, you could say, traffic friction, and they're very effective that way. Well, if I have an explanation like that, and then I can build out from it to apply it to other examples of what are termed self-organization, then I actually have an explanation for emergence. Not all emergence, because like I say, life has to emerge from self-organization. I am not just a whirlpool, nor are you. That doesn't explain our functional, fitted effort. But at least it gives us a sense of how emergence works. And the thing is that it's not some new thing added. It's not what they call in this research top-down causality, which would be like a good model for top-down is to think about people voting for a government that then, once it's in power, controls the people. That's not what's going on with the whirlpool. There was nothing added. There is no top. There's no down. It's just the interaction of a bunch of molecules that happens to self-organize this way. It falls towards the path of least resistance given the congestion. So that's actually a good framing for what's going on with emergence that gives us a clue at how to look for how selves could emerge from self-organization.
The other idea that came along when you were talking about this in the book is, I guess I would call it the trap of threshold ism. The idea that we see this in the artificial intelligence community, the idea if something was just complex enough, all of a sudden it will be conscious. The same idea oftentimes appears in the dynamic systems theory literature, that life is just going to pop out of this same process that gave us a whirlpool.
Yeah, so that's sort of what I was alluding to when I said that doesn't work because a tornado or the galaxy is more complex. I would say that the majority of researchers who I talk to these days who are addressing this issue allude to complexity as the explanation. And so that is a kind of thresholdism. That is, once something becomes sufficiently complex, it becomes conscious. My original term for it was eventual massivism. I was looking for a term that would imply a little bit of a disparagement, that eventually when you get a massive enough quantity of stuff, it just explains it. It doesn't explain it. So that is another one of the standard moves. Well, you just get enough of it together and it starts to become alive or come conscious. No, there's a whole lot of stuff in the universe and it's not alive. So unless you want to take the next dodge, which is to say, well, everything's alive. And that's also a popular alternative these days, which is the entire universe is conscious. A Stanford professor last week got a big bump on the internet from declaring it conscious.
I think we've got most of the basics in place for giving an overview of Deacon's proposed solution. Is there anything else we need before we can?
We haven't actually got it.
Okay, what else do we need?
We got right to the edge. So let me just, because what we never got to was the explanation for how life starts. I'm going to try to make a short version of it because I wouldn't want to leave everybody hanging. It actually reduces credibility if I don't actually get to an explanation. Deacon's explanation for the origins of selves and effort is actually the coupling of two self-organizing systems that are different from each other, such that they further constrain each other. They happen to constrain each other in a way where one regenerates the other. So I was talking a minute ago about whirlpools. Well, two other examples of self-organization are, you could say, chemical chain reactions, and another one is crystal formation. I won't get into the details here about why they are similar to the self-organization you see in a whirlpool, but the gist of it is that it's a spontaneous regularization. Well, what happens if you have a chain reaction that happens to generate, as a byproduct, it happens to generate the kind of molecules that crystallize to form shells? You got a chain reaction that, when it's operative, generates these shell molecules that happen to form shells that capture some of the chain reaction molecules together such that they form, you could say, the equivalent of a seed. Should it break open someplace else where the chain reaction could start, it would regenerate the process. It would make more shells, it would replenish the shell molecules, and it would keep together the chain reaction molecules such that they're more likely to start a chain reaction elsewhere. The main point here, and the book explains intuitively how this might work. It also explains how, once it started, it might evolve to be more responsive, more likely to open in the presence of environments where the chain reaction can work. But basically, we're talking about a system that alternates between completely open but tending towards regenerating closure in those shells, and shells that, when they break open, because they'll degenerate, are more likely to regenerate chain reactions that will regenerate them. So you could say there's a kind of a life cycle there. So the book explains in more detail how that works, but I want to get back to the core question, which was selves and effort are something different from nothing but physiochemistry. What and how did it start? Well, the difference, I want to say, is the unlikelification of degeneration. And what I just described, that chemical model, is how it becomes less likely that it would simply degenerate, would peter out and fall apart. And once you've got that going, it can evolve all the way out to us, is our speculation. Our greatest confidence is in that question, that we must explain selves and effort. Our second greatest confidence is in the hypothesis that the way to explain what we are that's different, not something added, but a reduction in possibilities, a reduction in probabilities. And then the third most confident aspect of our work is this model, what we call an autogen. And what I try to explain succinctly, I must have thrown out 800 pages writing that book because I just wanted to get it as simple and accurate as possible. That's the gist of it there.
I want to take a moment to remind you that I am still sending Amazon gift cards to people who post podcast reviews in Apple Podcasts or anywhere else. Just send a screenshot of your review to docartemis@gmail.com. Also, if you can, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, even if you actually listen in another app, such as the free Books and Ideas mobile app. And I remember when I talked to Terry, and I have to admit, because I read the transcript, not because I remember an interview from 8 years ago, he emphasized the idea of absences. That's his word for what you called the unlikeification.
That's right. Unlikelification or improbabilizing. It's terrible. I'm just kind of amazed that we don't have a good, clear word for that. I really am amazed by that. But that's why I had to come up with that term. But yes, we are alluding to the same thing. So one of the things I love about working with Terry is, like I say, he doesn't pull rank. I've been able to work with him very closely for 24 years, and I'm entitled to take my own perspective on it. I have not liked the word absence to explain it. I have a feeling that it sounds too much like a material absence or like total absence. It can sound a little esoteric. And he recognizes those challenges with it. You know, in this work, we have found it difficult to find words that don't carry the wrong baggage. Because in a way, we're walking a tightrope. The mind tends to assume a ghost or a machine, and we're walking this tightrope, and we can slip at any point down either side of that. So we're trying to avoid what you call basins of distraction that plague this field, because they're all around. We've been at this for all these years, and it's so vested. It matters so much to us. I chose instead to talk about how once probable things became less probable. And as a result, other things became more probable. That's what he was getting at with absence. So we are talking about the same thing there, just different words.
Where does information fit into this account?
Information is another term that is handled ghost and machine-like with the origins of life, which has to have a wimpy, simple beginning. That is, there's no engineer, there's no evolution, so it's got to start simple. But once it starts, with its start, you get the proto version of all the things that matter to us, including information. Well, the way information is currently handled in the field is equivocation between mechanisms. So it's an information can be like that cue ball taking a cue from me. Because why is it taking a cue? Because my cue stick did work on it. That is, it can be completely treated as a mechanistic idea, much like saying that information had an impact on me. It worked on me. It caused me to change my mind. That's all the kind of mechanistic version of what information is. But that's not how we use it in everyday life. Information is functionally fitted effort. That is, I make effort. One of the things I'm regenerating, for example, is my eyeballs. So I have to regenerate them so I can pay attention to the things that matter to me. That is, I need information. I need good information as compared to bad information. That means I need functional information, and it's about my circumstances. So it's functional fitted effort. You can't deny that that's part of what's going on with information, and yet there are researchers who basically act like you can deny it, that it's all cause and effect. So, for example, integrated information theory, it assumes the mechanistic version of what information is. You know, bits and bytes are what Claude Shannon developed, that whole system where information is a reduction in possibility. If you're flipping a coin and it comes up head, that's a reduction of 2 to 1. That's a bit of information. Never mind what it's about, never mind what it's for. So there, you get a theory like integrated information theory that says that the more dynamic coupling between systems, the more information and therefore the more consciousness. And they'll go so far as to say that a simple binary photoelectric switch is a little conscious. That's the kind of extent you can go to where you're pretending that computers think and that we're computers. That comes from treating information as a strictly physical phenomena, not noticing that basically that version of information says that anything that could go either of two ways and goes one way is information, without paying attention to the selves and the effort for whom it could be information.
I love the quote that you have in the book. I mean, you used it several times. A stop sign doesn't cause us to stop unless we run into it.
Yeah, that's right. We have to understand that information is radically different from physical causality. Information is not in the thing. We talk about this book showing or this sign telling. That's not what's happening. A sign doesn't tell. We interpret it as meaning something for us about something that matters to us. It's very open to interpretation. And one obvious difference between cause and effect and interpretation of information or interpretation of significance in things is that with cause and effect, you've always got a material source for the cause. But the absence of some material thing can also be information. If that stop sign was missing, that could mean something to me. If a friend doesn't write back, the absence of the letter could mean something to me. It's obviously not the same as cause and effect. But since we haven't had an explanation for selves and effort, we start to get into that mechanical-poetic styling where we say, well, it's information if it's a cause and effect relationship. And that's what we're trying to avoid in this research. We're trying to avoid the equivocation.
One of the ideas that you talk about is the fact that this solution is natural, but not materialist.
Yes, materialism assumes that all there is matter in interaction. And naturalism assumes that there are no supernatural, that is, there's nothing outside of what is potentially observable. Not that we've observed everything, but you don't get to simply posit something external to the observable and claim that it explains anything. So I think of science as a campaign to find natural explanations for all natural phenomena. And we don't know if the campaign will work, but that's what it's doing. So you can't smuggle in supernatural explanations for anything. At the same time, to reduce everything down to matter blinds you to something that is perfectly natural. So, for example, the congestion that results in a whirlpool because it results in some paths becoming less likely, that congestion is not exactly material. Sure, it's instantiated in matter. You couldn't have congestion without things getting congested, but the dynamic interaction between them, such that there's higher concentrations in one location, lower concentrations in other ones, therefore you get kind of a pattern of congestion or turbulence, that is often overlooked by materialists. Now, one could define materialism broad enough that it includes it. But since that's not been the norm, since we tend to look for, let's say, the atom of effort, the atom of selfhood, since we keep on thinking in thingy terms, like a motivation is a thing that causes things, I think that it has blocked certain avenues of exploration, like the one that I described here, where some possibilities become unlikely, not because some material thing imposed a new constraint on it, but because a process as dynamic as congestion makes some paths less likely.
Yeah, and I should comment, just for clarity for the listeners, that energy and matter are interchangeable in the materialistic worldview, correct?
That's correct. But then whether that accounts for the changes in probability that one gets in, let's say, congestion, is another question. So what Terry and I sometimes look for a way to talk about what is the palette from which you have to explain everything. One version of it is you've got the matter-energy thing, you've got the dynamic interaction between them, and you've got the tendency for concentrations to deconcentrate over time. That's the second law. I'm trying to find a more general way to talk about it. And that's just a tentative proposal for it. But yes, we're saying that you got to hold your feet to the fire here. You got to constrain your research so you can avoid the equivocation that comes naturally with this territory. It's just a fundamental vocational hazard if you're trying to explain life, is that you'll be walking that tightrope.
I have to say that I really appreciated your description of naturalism in this book. For many years, I've been sort of struggling, with my own sort of identity as to whether or not I am a materialist versus a naturalist, and was there really any difference? And really, from reading your book, I finally grasp it and say, yeah, naturalism makes sense, but no, I'm not a materialist. One of the examples you used that really helped me was talking about the difference between a living person and a dead body.
Ah, yes. I should say that Terry helped me jog my mind on this difference between natural and materialist by the use of that term absence. We were having a conversation one day, and he said, well, are absences natural? You could say that's the equivalent of is a reduced probability of something, or you could say is a gap, is a void between material things also natural? Is it material, is what he said. And I said, no, I see what you're saying. That's a difference. Yeah, so absences, gaps, voids, they're natural, but they're not material. So that's one of the ways we came at it. Just to clarify this point, we dance back and forth between talking about having our bodies and being our bodies. I conclude that we have our bodies, though that's not exactly accurate in the sense that I am not my body. I'm not my material physical matter. First of all, that stuff is throughput. It's changing. I'm not made of, I'm made through the stuff that's moving through me. And anyway, it's not making me, I'm making me. But at death, my body is all still there and I'm gone. So I suppose here it is a little metaphoric, and I just want to flag it as such. My computer is more durable than me. It's likely to be around after I'm gone, though it will decompose. Where am I when I die is, to me, a question that I'm not like a candle flame. Candle flames could be seen as self-organizing. I'm not just self-organizing, but still, it's like asking, where is that flame after it's gone out? It's not elsewhere. So I should be clear when I say my body remains even when I have disappeared. I haven't flown off anywhere. We don't subscribe to the idea that myself lives on elsewhere. I have a limerick about how I do believe in reincarnation in a strictly naturalistic sense. Reincarnation is real. Just how will reduce its appeal? It's your seeds and your deeds, not your soul. It recedes, hopping off after once round the wheel.
I work in palliative medicine, so I take care of people who are dying on a regular basis. And I think that's one reason why your reference to the difference between a living person and a dead body really, because and the other thing is it's not about consciousness, because most people spend the last days of their lives somewhere between deeply asleep and in a coma. Yet you can see that life is holding on. I mean, it is amazing. I take care of veterans and they are so tough. And without consciousness, life strives to continue. It's just something that you can't ignore in the kind of work that I do. So I really appreciated many of the ideas in your book.
I'm glad to hear. In Terry's work, a dead body's matter is free to do more things than it does when it's alive. Life is not an add-on to physics and chemistry. It's a subset of physical chemical dynamics that happen to keep it going. And when that subset becomes broader, it dies. It's the constraint that is what's keeping us alive.
You said it's easy to die. It's living that's...
Yeah, though I also completely agree with what you just said about the robustness of life by now. But I just said we have to remember, from so wimpy a beginning, life can't have started out suddenly robust and like veterans. No, it was they're tough.
I want to ask you one last question. How can Deacon's autogen account be tested?
This is a place where none of the people currently researching it are bench scientist chemists, but there's no reason it can't be tested. There's two things that can be tested. One is whether this is a plausible explanation that demonstrates that you could get mattering from matter, because we currently have no evidence of that. A second question is whether it is a real explanation for how life started anywhere in the universe or here on Earth. That's a separate question. But the way you'd go about this work is you would be doing all sorts of careful manipulations to try and get the system going. But if the system started going, so you're regenerating chain reactions that are regenerating the shells that regenerate the chain reactions, if you get that going, it would take on a life of its own at that point. That's how it becomes a testable theory. That is, it's okay to start it by manually, a sighted watchmaker, as long as it took on a real life of its own, where it's regenerating itself on its own behalf, which is different from designing, let's say, a computer or a computer model and letting it run as a simulation. This would be closer to an emulation. But then there's a whole separate question of whether the chemistry could have happened spontaneously. So it's two separate questions. But in a way, Terry's simply trying to show that it is feasible for life to come from nature. That would be testable even if it just took on a life of its own and was made with strange chemicals. This is making effort on its own behalf with respect to its environment. That's something.
Well, I hope that someday you'll be able to get some bench scientists to take this seriously and actually try it, because to me, I agree with you that the answer is intuitively appealing once you take the time to understand it. And I mean, I got that from Incomplete Nature, but I really appreciated the way that you made the idea even more accessible in your book.
Good. And yes, I agree. By the way, if you end up talking to any bench scientists who you think might be interested, feel free to point them our way. And it also could actually start as in virtuo chemistry. That's another way we could go at it.
Is there anything that you feel like we've left out that you really want to talk about?
I'll mention one brief thing. I started by telling a little bit of my personal story, how I started out in activism and then moved into this kind of attempt to take careful notes on us, on what it is to be alive, what it is to be a self. I have found great personal comfort from this perspective. I have a sense that it's fairly likely that over the next 30 years, we're going to have three, I'll call them cosmic wedgies. They will pull us up short. One is we will find evidence of extraterrestrial life. Another is we will discover, much to our chagrin, that life as we know it was more unstable than we knew it. That is, life as we know it may be changing in ways we don't want it to change. Extinctions, that sort of thing here. And the third is that we will come up with an explanation, a perfectly scientifically plausible explanation for us that really grounds us, that explains how selves emerge here or anywhere in the universe. So there's a way in which those three combine to give me a kind of peace of mind. Still a tragedy, some of them. I mean, really the tragedy is the second one, the changes to life as we know it. But a consolation in having taken notes during our short spell of civilization and when able to have answered this most fundamental riddle, which is, what are we at the most fundamental level? Just explaining us, and I mean us in the most general sense, not humans, not consciousness, not Western civilization. I mean life. To have an explanation for it that gives us some comfort to know that it's actually reasonably likely, and we have some evidence from the extraterrestrial life, that's happening elsewhere in the world. So even if our civilization doesn't sustain itself, we will have recognized that, we will have come to understand how it will happen again and again in the universe, how it's very likely to happen again and again. Now, I will go one step further and to say that with Terry's work on the origins of language, I think I have an explanation for why we are such a slippery species, humans. So I'm actually quite confident that elsewhere in the universe, they have dealt with not just climate crisis, but climate crisis denial. I think that language makes it so we become an organism that can be very good at ignoring things, rationalizing, ignoring impending problems. So we have extraordinary foresight. We are extraordinarily visionary as a creature, but we are also extraordinarily delusional. That just comes with the territory of language. I don't share the contempt for humankind that I hear among some of my friends lamenting the current tragedies. We are right on schedule. This is exactly the kind of problem we would be dealing with as an organism making effort drunk on language. This is what would happen. The work is an attempt to be really rigorous, but I got to say, I got some very personal takeaways from this work. It's been a delight to have this. And as for the end of civilization, well, I was going to die anyway, but boy, did I want it to keep going. And so I still work on that a lot. I still work to try and do what I can. But what I can do is limited, as is the case with all of us. We are somnipotent. We have some power.
Do you have any advice for students?
I'm not sure this will work for a thriving career, but it certainly will work for a life well spent. Be doggedly focused on the simple questions that are often overlooked. That's what I think Terry did in both of his areas of research, and I find it very impressive, the bounty he gained from it. You'll often be better off career-wise in specializing on something narrow and fundable, but at least for me, and I certainly see it in Terry, to have focused on these simple questions just with dogged attention and intolerance of ways of denying the questions. What is a self? How does it start? What is trying? How does it start? That's been really rewarding.
Yeah, many of the scientists that I've interviewed have said something very similar to what you just said. And it sounds like the root answer here is that you have to have a question that you really care about.
That's really true. So my first 38 years or so, I wasn't by nature a nerd. I read dutifully. I read, I would say, for status. I found some interesting ideas in the work. But suddenly, when I had a visceral curiosity, when I was really eaten up by curiosity about it, I became a completely different kind of reader, voracious. In effect, I had a coat hanger or rack. I had my questions gave me a reason to retain things that I didn't have before I had the live questions that were eating me up. So I'm really grateful for life-size questions and a very full inbox of things to think and think it up a notch again about these questions. That's a really lucky state.
That's a great observation. I mean, I get sometimes emails from students who ask me what they should read, and I want to give them an answer that's kind of what you just said, but I don't know how to put it into words that, like when I'm reading for my podcasts, I have some basic questions I wonder about, specifically a lot to do with consciousness because I podcast about the brain. Every time I get a review copy of a book from a publisher, and I get several every week, I'm really looking for, are they addressing a question I care about? And I might not even know I care about the question until I read what it is. But if the question doesn't light my fire, the book is never going to get read.
And I also don't think I probably could have gotten to where I am about reading much earlier than I did. That is, I had to read a whole lot and somehow not have the standard high schooler's response to be all of this imposed reading, which is, they come into school with lots of curiosity and they come out saying, sorry, I asked. I didn't get there. And actually, in my case, it's a little rare. It was really visceral questions for me. I'm not ashamed to admit it was my midlife crisis that made me eaten up by curiosity about the questions I'm dealing with. And now I do most of my reading actually by listening. This week, I've fallen madly in love with Hannah Arendt.
Oh, wow.
I thought of her only as a political scientist, and I'm reading her last book, which is called The Life of the Mind. She's asking, how does language change an organism? She basically gives a complete and very thorough, careful survey. She read Latin, Greek, everything, of thinking about the will. Well, what is the will? It's effort. It's just magnificent to be scooped by such a great mind in terms of what interests her.
Yeah, I haven't read that. I think I've read some Hannah Arendt, but it's been quite a number of years. I think I need to let you go, Jeremy, but I have really enjoyed talking with you.
I'm very glad to hear that. And stay in touch any old time.
I want to thank Jeremy Sherman for taking the time to talk with me, and I highly recommend that everyone read his book, Neither Ghost Nor Machine, The Emergence and Nature of Selves. He makes a challenging topic both accessible and interesting. I can only give you an overview, but I would like to highlight a few key ideas. First, the question that Terrence Deacon and Jeremy Sherman are addressing is, how did purpose emerge in a purposeless universe? The first key idea is that most of the universe really does lack a purpose. Inanimate objects do not strive toward any goals. It doesn't matter how complex they become. Galaxies and tornadoes are quite complex, but they are not selves. So what is a self? According to Sherman, there are three things that a self has to do: regenerate, protect itself, and also it has to do self-reproduction. Although during the interview, he mostly focused just on striving to do things as the distinguishing feature of a self. So asking about the origin of purpose is to ask, how did life emerge from a lifeless universe? This is a question that tends to be either ignored or avoided. But the reason Sherman called his book Neither Ghost Nor Machine was to highlight the most popular non-answers. The phrase ghost clearly refers to supernatural explanations, but ghosts also creep into scientific approaches. For example, to attribute the origin of life to emergence doesn't really answer the question. The phrase machine refers to approaches that dismiss purpose as an illusion and don't acknowledge that life is fundamentally different. In his book, Sherman bluntly states that many scientific approaches are really just equivocations rather than true attempts to answer the question. During the interview, we focused on the importance of the question and on why we seem to be surrounded by non-answers. So we actually only touched briefly on Deacon's proposed solution, which is called the autogen. The basic idea is simple. It is that two processes that would dissipate on their own could couple and thereby create a self-perpetuating entity. I'm really tempted to explain this in more detail and to discuss their arguments against other approaches, including the information-first approach, the RNA-first approach, and the metabolism-first approach. But this episode is already way too long, so I'm going to encourage you to read the book instead. Also, don't forget to go back to episode 47 to hear Terrence Deacon's own account of his work. Now, if there's sufficient interest, I could do another episode on this topic in the future. So please do send me feedback via email at docartemis@gmail.com, voice feedback at speakpipe.com/docartemis, DOCARTEMIS, or post to the Books and Ideas Facebook fan page. I warn you that I don't really look at Facebook much, so you need to email me. The fan page is really for letting other people know what you think. Of course, I also appreciate your financial support on Patreon because that helps to defer the cost of audio editing. If you would like to help out, just go to patreon.com/books and ideas. You can select a monthly pledge that fits your budget. Or if you'd rather make a one-time donation, you can use Venmo, where my username is also, you guessed it, Doc Artemis. Finally, I want to remind you that in April, Books and Ideas will begin coming out on the third Friday of the month. I'm doing this to even out my production schedule, so it will be Grain Rainbows on the first Friday, Brain Science on the second Friday, Books and Ideas on the third Friday, and Brain Science on the fourth Friday. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Books and Ideas is copyright 2020 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at docartemis@gmail.com. Theme music for Books and Ideas is The Open Door by Beatnik Turtle. Please visit their website at beatnikturtle.com.